Welcome, everyone, to our webinar speaking about entrepreneur and executive in residence programs at academic institutions from the perspectives of the EIRs themselves. I'm Kirsten Leite of Osage University Partners. So happy to be here with you today. And next slide. I'm really pleased to be joined by three excellent panelists today talking about their experiences as EIR, XIR, MIR, whatever the flavor is that you want to call this, at their particular institutions. And I have them do a brief 36-second introduction, and we're going to have them delve more into their backgrounds in just a bit. So Althea, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Kristen. So my background, I like to call myself a reformed scientist. I was trained as a geneticist and then did a postdoc in neuroscience and then went into tech transfer, and I really enjoyed it there. And then moved over to a new venture creation firm where I spent about 8 years building out opportunities out of academic institutions that we partnered with and started companies and put some seed capital towards that in the life sciences. This past year and a half, I've been working as an entrepreneur in residence and doing some consulting work on the side.
Thanks, Althea. Julie?
Hello, everyone. I am Julie Schoenfeld, and I am the Physical Sciences Entrepreneur in Residence at Caltech, and also one of the seed fund managers. We have a small seed fund there. My background is that I am a serial entrepreneur. I have led 4 venture-backed startups myself from scratch. 3 of them have been acquired, most recently one by General Motors for the sensor for the self-driving car. And in the last 5 years or so, I have been working at Caltech and helped spin out about 25 different companies, really hard tech science companies, trying to use the experience I had running my own businesses and impart some of the hard lessons I learned along the way. 2 of them were in hardware, 2 of them are in software, and so that's where I focus.
Thanks, Julie. Don?
Hi, everybody. Don Manfredi. I'm at the University of Michigan. I started as a mentor in residence here and have transitioned from that to managing the physical sciences portfolio for our office, in addition to one of our pre-seed funds that we stood up to invest in public university licensed intellectual property startups in the state. So before that, plant floor analytics, machine vision, robotics, climbing around tooling and plants, so aligned with the physical sciences side of the house.
Great. So you can see that we have a wealth of experience here. I'm really appreciative of all of you being here for this particular webinar. Before we actually dive into our subject, we'll go to the next slide. We're going to talk about a few logistics. A recording of this webinar is going to be available on OUP's partner portal, and a recording will also be available publicly via our YouTube channel. You can see QR codes here at the bottom to go to either one of those resources. Just to let you know, the partner portal is an online portal for tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner universities that's full of relevant tech transfer and startup content. Once you're in the portal, which you do need to register for if you haven't already done so, you'll find the downloadable presentation deck. We're not really going to have much of a deck today. It's mainly going to be Q&A, as well as the link to this particular webinar on the webinars page. We do encourage questions throughout the webinar. We're going to ask you to use the Q&A tool. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we do have a lot of questions teed up for our group, but if you can ask questions through Q&A tool today, that would be terrific. We do have other upcoming webinars as well that may be of interest to our audience, including a webinar on the basics of SBIR and STTR grants. We're going to have 3 different people from the federal government coming and talking about those particular programs. That is going to be on July 17th. And then another webinar that we're working on right now, but we don't have a date for yet, probably in late July or early August, is going to be talking with some people who have just raised some early stage funding for their startups and how they did that. So keep a lookout for those announcements as well soon. Going to the next slide. So a short intro on OUP for those of you who do not know us. We're a venture fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising something called participation rights that are available through their licenses. For those of you who don't know what participation rights are, they are the ability to invest in future rounds of a company on the same terms and conditions as other investors. We do have recommended language on this if you do not already include participation rights in your license agreements. As a part of this partnership, the academic institutions share in our profits, and they also receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups. We're now on our fourth fund, and we've made investments in over 150 companies in all areas of deep science, with many of those companies having successful exits already. We've been really fortunate about a lot of the institutions we worked with and the startups that we've been able to invest out of them. And you can see a bunch of those on our next slide, which shows a bunch of our portfolio companies and the breadth of areas that we invest in as well. So we kind of track the institutions that we work with, that the areas that they are creating these novel innovations in, that's where we're investing in. So we'll go to the next slide just to talk about the format of our webinar today. As for those of you who've been a part of our webinars before, you know that we often have slides. This is going to be a discussion format, so no slides, just the lovely faces of our panelists here today talking about what it is that they do. I do want to provide a few comments on the goals of this particular webinar. We're not going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of how these programs are actually run at the academic institutions. We do have a previous webinar on that. We'll pull up the link to that if you want, and we'll put it in the chat in just a bit. But we're really going to be talking today about, with these XIRs, EIRs, MIRs, about the specific work that they do with the faculty members and other people looking at creating startups at the universities. So this will be useful for the programs that perhaps are already running at certain universities, if people are looking at creating these types of programs, or if someone's considering being an EIR themselves. Okay, so with that, let's take down the slides and we'll go ahead and jump into our subject. So I'm going to have each of you start out by describing the programs you belong to and why you joined that particular program. And Althea, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, great. So hopefully I do UCSF justice. I still don't quite understand the intrigue behind the scenes in the tech transfer office, but they have a group called the Engagement and Opportunity Development Team, or EOD, and they really work on triaging opportunities. Essentially you kind of get technology that comes through that could be just licensing, or it could potentially have startup potential or need incubation or development time. And so a lot of those get triaged through the EOD team, and they work heavily with the XIRs, or executive in residence. Don't ask me too much about the nuances between entrepreneur versus executive versus, but we're called XIRs at UCSF. And that's been a really fantastic experience for me. Hopefully others feel the same way in the group, but the EOD group really brings in to opportunities that they've already done some level of triage with the faculty and done some internal market analysis and IP analysis. And then the XIRs get together with the EOD team and just kind of do a weekly triage of what is interesting, give some comments, concerns, potential connectivity of certain outside industry KOLs, or just, this seems very much like a licensing opportunity. This is probably not something that we should be talking through much further, and give some, feedback on that end. And then from there, the XIRs are really expected to start to do some additional deep dives into technologies and working with different faculty members. They like us to have about 4 different projects that we're working with, and it is sort of like a matchmaking kind of experience. You're really looking for that next sort of startup to help develop and deep dive into. So I've done everything from revamping pitch decks to just kind of talking through competitive landscape, doing some outreach of like, this isn't really my area, but this feels like there could be a there. And so getting some feedback from more experts outside and kind of connecting that with the inventors and faculty members who are interested in pushing it forward. So that's kind of and the main goal is really to have the XIRs take a company if everything kind of aligns well, and go run that externally.
And I'm curious, is that the reason that you joined the program? That's one of the...
Yes, I mean, I love creating, and that was like the part of my job as a venture capitalist. New creation kind of piece is like building out what, it's that initial, like, this is an idea, this is a technology that's really different. How do we get this out there? And then what are the major gaps that we have, and really kind of working through how do you fill that. I have also really enjoyed just working with like really smart people, and looking at cutting edge science, and helping with that crafting of, especially research scientists, you're looking at how do I prove out my hypothesis, but often that translational piece is missing still, and life sciences especially. I know I'm amongst physical science people, but it is a really heavy lift, and the amount of capital that you need to get to the clinic is huge, and so the risk component to it is quite large. And so the more you can really do head-to-head comparisons initially, and that stuff isn't really lending itself to a grant writing kind of exercise. It's more of a, how do we quickly do a go, no go kind of experiment and milestones there. And so having those conversations, sometimes they're tough, but I enjoy that piece of it.
Great. Thanks, Althea. Don, same question to you.
Yeah. So we have a slightly different program. We call ours a mentor in residence. So the main difference fundamentally is that we want you to stay here and work with startups continuously. If it happens that you end up joining a startup as, a business lead, we don't try to stop it or block it, but we'd prefer you to stay with us and continue to work with the faculty here that are producing this amazing research. I joined the program back in 2017 as an MIR, and the way it kind of worked out was kind of luck, really, more than anything. Throughout my career, I really enjoyed teaching, engaging with people. I was an adjunct faculty at a local school up in Southfield. I was, volunteering at Ann Arbor Spark, which is one of our biz dev groups here in Ann Arbor that does a lot of economic development and a lot of startup support services. So I was helping there, and it just was one of those things I was really passionate about, engaging, teaching, helping. And I was actually meeting with an old competitor, and he mentioned he had just cycled off as an MIR for U of M, and that it might be something I'd be interested in. And I called Mike Saratakis, who runs our group, or at that time ran the group, and we had the conversation, and I was lucky enough to join the team, back then. And our goal is to just, amplify the impact of the research happening here. So if one of our faculty members decide they want to go down that startup path, we're going to be all in to try to help them. The mentor's role is incredibly critical for that piece of it, because that mentor becomes, kind of like the consigliere, you name it. They provide business support, they provide therapy sometimes, they provide, you name it, any type of guidance that's required to move the business forward. I still actively mentor, even though I'm in a slightly different role managing here, but I keep an active portfolio of at least 10 companies, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on, what our bandwidth is or what our pipeline's looking like. So, I'll never stop helping early stage founders, figure things out faster. That's kind of the thing I love to do more than anything else.
That's awesome. Great. Julie, same question to you.
Sure. So my mission at Caltech is to help the faculty and students spin out as many technology companies as they can, and to provide them with the resources to make that happen. One thing I noticed when I was running startups in Southern California is that we did not have the richness in number of startups as you have in Northern California. So if you can get pockets of startups going, you create this ecosystem where there's a lot more talent. So at Caltech, we have 3 entrepreneurs in residence. We have a life science entrepreneur in residence, we have physical science, and we also have a space science person who's from Jet Propulsion Labs, which is run by Caltech on behalf of NASA. At any given time, we're nursing about 40 ideas. And not all of these ideas become companies, but we provide the support and try to help them form these business plans based on our experience. So we have a number of funding opportunities. We have some early stage money because it's really hard to get something out of the lab, and that first check, in my opinion, is the hardest check to get. So our Caltech Seed Fund, We write a small amount, something on the order of $200,000 to $500,000 checks. We, as an entrepreneur in residence, I help syndicate, so I find other angel investors who write those small funds. So if you can get somebody $1 million, that's generally enough to get them started. I joined the program because I was finished with my startup. I was exhausted, but I thought to myself, I have all this knowledge, and who could use this? And so it's actually quite a joy to be able to share some of my lessons learned, both with faculty and students, and help them on their journey.
That's fantastic. And you're full-time with the university, that's right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, next question then, and this, Julie, I'm going to ask this one of you first. What skills from your background did you bring that you think are particularly useful for the founders that you're working with?
Well, I think it's the practical, roll up the sleeves and know how to get it done. So there are a couple of things that you have to be really good at when you are doing a startup. The first one is you have to be able to sell. You have to be able to get your idea across. And so early on in my career, before I started doing startups, I actually became a sales rep, which is probably the greatest training I had for being an entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs are always selling. So I do spend a lot of time, when you talk about building the investor deck, that's the storytelling that comes with selling. And so I spend a lot of time on that area. The second area is, how do you know you have a good idea? We see a lot of solutions looking, there's a lot of solutions looking for a problem, and it's really kind of forcing the discipline to say, what problem am I trying to solve? Why am I going to solve it better? Who else is doing it? It's really fairly analytic, but you'd be surprised how few people do it. And then finally, in fact, the most important thing of succeeding in a startup is getting the team right. If you have somebody who's not committed, or you have too many egos in the room, it's generally a guarantee that it's going to fail. So the ability to sort of help with team dynamics, make suggestions, bring in talent, these are some of the things that I help with, and I do think they make a big difference.
Thanks. Same question to you, Althea.
I second everything Julie just said. I definitely did not have the PR marketing background. And so I've learned over time. I still think I undersell things, but I think as a scientist, you're just always so much on the data demonstrates this, which, and honestly, those pitches fall so flat because you're not actually talking about the promise. And so really understanding how to help founders convert from their basic science kind of regimen to talking about more of that promise that we can do this and we can do it well, and here's what our actual problem that we're solving is. And it sounds simple, but when you actually come down to trying to put that on paper and put it in a concise pitch deck, that's where things really tend to fall off and become very mired down into the details rather than keeping it very high level. And then I think the other piece of just having been through so many of these in my previous job, just understanding where those gaps, like how are you actually going to get this out, and is this really a meaningful type of questions. And it's nice to be a bit of an outsider, I think, because you can kind of bring a separate voice with a little bit more of a difference in, experience. And this is what I'm seeing in the market. It's not that you have a bad idea, but let's talk about, can you pivot it? Or maybe your next idea is a better one to spend your time on in terms of a startup. And so having those kinds of conversations too, I think, is important. And, unfortunately I've had those all through my career. So
Pivoting is just a part of a career.
Pivot.
John, anything else you'd add on the skills side from your background that you're bringing for the
everybody? Yeah, the stuff that was brought up initially, for sure the sales skills piece is huge. But for me, the ability to listen, the ability to kind of crack the code quickly on some of these ideas and then really be able to chart a path, in the first couple of meetings of what it could or couldn't be. So your ability to see around corners is pretty important. And then for me, like, this just happened when I got here, but I say this all the time, the ability to suspend disbelief for long enough to let the idea marinate. And, because if you walk in and you make this gestalt decision on this something, in the first meeting, you might be doing a disservice. So that patience and willingness to really understand the idea before you start plotting the course is pretty important. But a lot of that comes back to just your ability to relate with people. If you have reasonable people skills, I believe that is maybe more important. I'll say the exception will be life sciences because you have to know how to get through all of the regulation and there's some, but in the physical sciences world, that ability to relate and build trust and rapport and it's so critical to establishing that relationship.
I think all of this is incredibly helpful for those who either have programs or considering their programs when they're looking at, the attributes of the people that potentially they're going to be hiring in to these programs. So thank you so much for discussing that question with us. Next, we're going to talk with you about the types of tasks you perform with founders. And I'd particularly like to hear about any practical questions you kind of receive on a regular basis from them. Like you're kind of like, okay, I know I'm going to get this question every single time. And what are the practical things that you are helping them with? Any real examples would be super helpful on this. And Don, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Sure. Funding gets brought up quite a bit. You're going to meet these founders at various stages in their research careers and also in their commercialization journeys, right? So if you hit one that's a frequent flyer that's been through the process before, some of those questions get held. But if it's somebody that hasn't gone through this and they haven't gone through how to fund, say, through PFI or SBIR or STTR, that's a big piece of it. Like, how am I going to pay for this, right? That comes up all the time. The other piece would be you get a lot of questions about team development. Will I have to leave my academic role? That's a question I get all the time. And the way I answer that is no, but somebody has to run the business. So if you're not going to be able to do it full time, then let's go find somebody that can. Because if you're not watching, if you're not paying attention to it, it's going to have less of a chance to be successful. Then other than that, those are the probably the top three I get the most. In addition to just, the blocking and tackling stuff about how good the idea is and how much potential it has. I really try to demystify the whole process immediately. And the way I do that, I learned this from doing National I-Corps. One of the teaching teams said, a startup's just like doing research. You essentially create a hypothesis and then you run experiments to try to disprove it. And I almost start every conversation with a new PI saying that, like, hey, this is not, it's different, but you have the discipline already. You know how to do this, and we're going to do it in a different context, but we're going to get kind of the same results, So trying to get them comfortable immediately into the paradigm of that they're not going to have to become, business people overnight. Is a big piece of it. But as far as tasks, anything that's required to move the business forward, we will do. As long as it's obviously legal and ethical, we're not. But if it's, and I'm not afraid to, there's a fine line, and I know there's some questions later that are going to touch on this. You do have to, I believe there's a significant teaching portion here so that I can't be doing all of the work for the person. Somebody's got to do it and learn how to do it. Because I may not, or the MIR that's on the case may not always be there for them. So you have to be willing to draw a line at a certain point so that they are learning how to do it. So when you're not around, things are going to continue. But there hasn't been a thing that I wouldn't do to help one of my startups. I can't think of one. So
that's great. Julie, same question to you on these practical questions you receive and any real examples.
Yeah, probably the ones I get every week are how do I divide up startup equity? And I will say Osage has put together a bunch of programming in the past that has some fabulous templates on how to do that. So, if the professor is involved, but they're only working, as an advisor, is that 2%? Is it 20%? That happens all the time. I also get requests for templates of good investment decks. How do you put together a financial plan for a startup? And so what we've done is we have a series, we keep a rolling library where we send that out, but we also have an internship program in the summer where we run a lot of programming ourselves and teach people some of these things. So those are sort of the practical day-to-day things that we help people with. But the stuff I like is once you get all of that behind you, and somebody's out trying to raise money and they're hitting a brick wall. I like to get involved there because that's where I had to learn the hard way how to do that. And so if somebody comes to me and they said, I've called on 30 VCs and I'm getting nowhere, I usually, time out, guys, that's a problem. Because if you've called on 30 people and you're getting nowhere, you got a problem and you don't know what the problem is. So I like to sort of dissect what's wrong in the fundraising. And a lot of times, venture capitalists or angel investors will not tell you why they're not investing. They'll say, well, it's too early for us. That's the favorite line. It's too early for us. Or, well, it's not quite in our investment strategy. And at the end of the day, what they're really saying is you didn't get the ball over the line. And so what I try to do is introduce them to VCs that I know, and then those VCs will tell me what they didn't like about it. And that way I can coach the company on how to work their way through that. I think at the very early stage where all of us are, who are at the riskiest point of the investment curve. And companies that I have thought were going to be successful at this stage weren't. So it's hard to pick the winners. So I always say, but I can pick the losers, because there's certain categories of things that happen where people are not going to succeed. And generally it has to do with their ability to sell the story, how the team has come together. So my goal is to help them at least look like a winner and then hope for the best.
Love it. I love it, Julia. That's such great practical advice. Althea, same question to you on the types of tasks you perform and the practical questions you're answering. And then you're on the life sciences side, so maybe a little bit different.
Not to make too sharp a contrast between anything. I mean, I think it is all under one bucket, though. Like, you have the same sort of angst and concerns and lack of salesmanship or understanding sort of how to adapt your message to investors. So I think like equity is obviously a huge concern. The one thing I always bring out, which is, tried and true, which is like you're fighting over 100% of zero. Like, you need a team effort. And so really understanding, and that team dynamic too, often, I'm always consistently surprised by these premier scientists who aren't talking across institutions enough and bringing in some of their colleagues as advisors. So especially in life sciences, when you're trying to develop a drug, really presenting externally that this is a multi-institutional vetted approach is always a really good thing to do. So I think some of it is just having those conversations of just, what have you done to really truly vet this and bring in the right people. And they don't have to have equity, or they can have a small percentage of equity. You're sharing something that hopefully will be much larger. So those conversations around equity, I think, are important. And then, in terms of tasks, the thing that I end up doing the most of, and I actually really gravitate towards, is that messaging, honing in on sort of what data do you really have? How do we put this together in a concise manner to pitch? And who is going to be interested in this? And life sciences, especially, you're kind of following a bit of market trends. Like, what are VCs really interested in right now? you want to be on that, what is the crystal ball kind of like edge of things, because as soon as you're like, okay, it's brain interface, like all of that's gone, right? Because you already have like companies that are in sort of mid to later stage investment cycles, and so kind of understanding where things are breaking next is also helpful, and helping direct the scientists who have programs that could potentially fall into that space is also kind of another task and set of questions that I often get.
Great. Well, that actually, I think, leads nicely into our next question, which is about what, if any, general advice do you provide on time and roles for the researchers in the startup? So these are researchers at the institution. I'd like you to talk both about faculty as well as grad students and postdocs, and what they need to understand as far as time commitment associated with a startup and what those potential roles are that they can play. And Althea, I'll start with you on this one.
Sure. I mean, every university is different in how their policies are. But from an investment, like putting my investor hat on, you want a full-time team at the end of the day. Like, who are you investing in and who's going to go run this? And so having that conversation with the PIs of like, yeah, you're going to be the scientific advisor, unless you're willing to like quit your day job, which, most of them are not. And so, even if you can have them kind of span that, university policy and do two things, at the end of the day, the company is going to suffer if you don't have that full time. And so kind of talking through that. Often you have a postdoc or a graduate student attached to the opportunity too, and they're fantastic in terms of like being able to say, we can, do the technology transfer, we're bringing the know-how with us into the company, but also recognizing with them that you're probably going to need to hire someone more senior that has done it before, that is also able to translate their science into a commercial product ultimately. And so making sure you're having those discussions as you're talking through, like, how would we build out this company, is a good exercise, I think. And that also helps with like, not having surprises at the end. But having that sort of matter of fact conversation, I think is just such an important piece of it right from the get-go.
Don?
Yeah, I agree with everything Althea said, but I'll add that, again, for me, I'm always really cognizant of just trying to make this whole startup thing approachable. So, I do talk to the PI about the role and that someone needs to focus on it, but I'm definitely not going to go to the level of, well, you have to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to get your startup off the ground. I mean, we all know that there are fits and starts and times of Herculean effort and times of when you can't even get arrested. So, don't freak them out that they have to do a full-time job and then spend another 1,000 hours on top of it. But explain to them that it is important that they have to start thinking about the team. They have to have somebody minding the shop. So that is a big piece of it. And, the other part of this is, again, first conversation with a PI is always about what are your goals for this business? Because if you wanted to have, a brass ring grab that gets you on buying an island in 5 years, that startup journey is looking different than if you said, I just want to have a nice $20 million business with 20 people that jump out of bed and sprint to work every morning and we do really cool stuff. Both of those businesses are important, but what it looks like to actually scale one are completely different. So you have to meet them where they're at and give them the adequate advice that fits and right sizes with what they're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah, Julie.
Yeah, I'd echo what Don said about really understanding people's goals for why they're doing the startup. I had the experience, one of my companies, where we started a company. It was a hard tech company, and my co-founder, that was the technical guy, we never sat down and said, "What's your goal for this company?" We said, "And what happens if you leave?" And so what happened was we raised our first round, and the day after the money hit the bank, he said, "I'm going to go do my own startup." And we had never agreed on what happens then. And so what I've seen a lot is that couple of professors decide to do a startup. They go, okay, we're going to do a startup, 30%, each of us, three of us, 33% of the shares. And that's the whole discussion that they have. So I put together what I call a founder discussion, where you sit down in a room and you literally talk through what happens if one of us leaves, what happens to the shares, what if one of us doesn't like the direction, and really try to work all that stuff out at the beginning, because it's so disruptive to a company if people are mismatched, and that happens a lot. With regard to startups in general, I have seen at Caltech and elsewhere professors or PIs who are relatively hands-off, inventors who are relatively hands-off. I've seen them be technical advisors where they spend about 20% of their time in the startup as, major technical advisor. And then I've seen professors take a leave of absence because they're so invested in the idea. I think investors really like it when a professor is willing to put their whole self behind an idea. But I think the most common thing is the 20% advisor. And in that case, what you really want to have is a great PI who's 100% invested. Because if everybody's just sort of half in, not a good idea, not a good idea. And so you want a great PI, student, generally PhD, recent grad, good communication skills, really strong technically, can take it through the first couple of milestones, and then is open to finding a real professional CEO who might have done it before.
Great. Well, we have a couple of questions now on this, on these particular things that you've just brought up. One is, Julie, would you be willing to share your founder discussion guide, if that is actually like a written guide?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I'm happy to do it. It's, you have to be careful because when it's a guide, not an agreement, because if it's a formal agreement, you have to disclose it at the funding and all of that. But you have to have a common language, and so that everybody knows what's going on. So yes, I will send it to you so you can distribute it.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. And then just based on, everything all of you have said throughout this, someone wrote in that it seems like having a senior or seasoned team member to run a startup is important. Do you provide or have a list of business talent that you can associate with the startup, or do you make recommendations of who those people? And maybe Don, I'll start with you because I see you nodding on this.
Yeah. So the only thing I'll say is that experienced isn't always mandatory. I will tell you, as long as you have somebody like an MIR, EIR there, we've had really good luck with postdocs taking out companies. I have 3 in my portfolio that I still actively mentor that they're CEOs, and they are not only surviving, they're thriving, but they needed to have somebody with them to kind of help them, navigate the early parts of this. And then, so we went as far as to create a mastermind group of new postdoc CEOs and met every month and things like that to try to help push them forward. But yeah, you have to have, the talent gap is probably one of the toughest things that we manage. And I'm assuming it's the same for everybody. But so we are constantly scouring the ecosystem, trying to find, people that are willing to work with the startups in a full-time capacity. And as you all, I'm sure, know, you're looking for people that, could potentially work for a period of time with no salary and only for equity. So you want to get somebody that's got all the talent and skill level that maybe could probably get $500,000 out in the world to work for free. So it's not easy. But it's a constant thing that we're working on. We just did a program called the Accelerate Blue Foundry, where we went and did a national matchmaking we picked 20 of our higher profiled startups, and we went out and found as many people as we could and did some matchmaking to try to push that, close that talent gap. But yeah, it's a full-time gig to try to find people that are willing to work at this stage, for sure.
I'm going to ask, and Althea, maybe I'll ask this one of you first. When one of the challenges that I think when making the transition from academia to startups is pace and focus. And can you talk a little bit about how people have made that transition? Do some people fall into it really easily, that their pace and how they're focusing things is different than in academia? I'm not sure if that's a very well-formed question, but it's just about like thinking about things differently and thinking about that pace, because you have a very set timeline that you have to do things in at a startup because of your funding.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's really challenging because you're playing by a totally different set of rules, and what your success metrics look like. I think from more on the science side, I've had teams that I've brought over from academia into a startup, and I'll use that as an example. And they were fantastic bench scientists, and one of the things that I found was I had to come in and talk to them weekly because uh, they were very much on the, making sure that the experiment was perfect. It's publication ready. And I'm like, we're on the, is it good enough? Does it give us a yes or no answer? Like time is money feel to it. We have a timeline that we need to adhere to hit this milestone. Here are our higher level goals. And I think that adaptation is hard. And so I think individuals struggle often from that transition because the metrics are different, and you are having to get used to more of like, lack of a better term, mediocrity. It's like, is it good enough? Yes, move on. And so I think that piece is hard. And then also understanding how all of the other pieces that you need to do for drug development, for instance, fit in and inform. And so your timelines and how you're running things in parallel become key. And so that type of skill set is also not usually trained in academia. So all of those pieces kind of need to fill in terms of team. One of the things I found, it's not perfect, especially early stage though, is often you can get those really good senior advisors and kind of gap fill a little bit and help support those new and up and coming postdocs, or people who are really interested in learning how to do business and transition into a startup. And so doing that as a supplement until you find that right CEO is also an important piece too, I think.
Yeah. Well, so, Althea, since you brought up team, I'm going to move on to that particular question. What do you coach your founders on regarding team development for a startup company? And Julie, I'll throw that to you first.
Oh boy. So I'm going to dovetail on the last question because you were asking about pace. And, I was thinking about the impedance mismatch between the university pace versus the startup pace. And not everybody can make that transition. In fact, I was thinking at Caltech, of the 300 or so professors that we have, there may be more, only about 40 of them, I would say, are entrepreneurial and want to be entrepreneurial. And then once you get to them wanting to be entrepreneurial, then you have to then find out, are they willing to move at the speed that you really need to? So Althea talked about, you have to fail quickly in a startup. And so you got to find people who are of that mindset. So one of the starting points is that at Caltech, we find out about the technology when they file the patents in our office. So we start getting to know the scientists and the team as they are going through the process of explaining the technology. And you can determine, like, oh my goodness, this is not somebody who could do a startup because they're so literal, they're so perfect, they have to get it just so, versus somebody who is open to suggestion, is willing to listen. And so one of the key things is really coachability. And for those of you who are listening who may be thinking about doing a startup, remember, when you come to the office and try to license technology and so forth, every interaction you have is being noted by somebody. And so it's easy to say, wow, that person would be a fantastic CEO. Second thing is, when you're doing these little companies, the CEO or the person leading the project drives the pace. So that's why that person has to be so strong. And then finally, when it comes to teams, I always encourage the team to take a good look at themselves and hire their weakness. I see too many startups where you have the same type of individual in every position, or you have, I say, the tuba player is playing the flute. You want the finance person to do the finance. You want the CEO to set the strategy and do the fundraising. So it's really a session of looking at your skill set and trying to backfill your weaknesses.
I love any reference that has to do with like marching band and music. So that was great, Julie. Don, I'm going to throw the same question to you about coaching your founders on team development.
I was just thinking about transitioning from tuba to flute. That's a big jump. I actually mentored the flute instructor at U of M. She's amazing, but I don't know if she can play tuba. But anyway, so Julie, when you met when the question about frequently asked questions came up, this is the equity piece is where this becomes a pretty important conversation because you meet the founder and you understand that no one is going to love the idea or the business more than they are, right? And many times they may overvalue it a little bit and they may want to keep all the equity for themselves. So before you start talking about bodies and seats and filling roles, you kind of have to say, listen, how are you going to attract this talent? Because if you just go, ta-da, here's my idea, it's possible no one's going to say, oh, sign me up for free. I want to do it. So they have to be able to sell the idea just as hard to people that they're trying to attract to join the company as they would to try to sell it to a customer. They also need to be generous, but not, with their equity, they have to make sure that they're willing to share part of the back end potential big payout so that they can attract talent when they don't have enough actual cash in hand to pay the people to do the work. So we want to get that conversation, sorted as soon as we possibly can before we start thinking about who to bring in. And then it just becomes an exercise on, I agree too, you got to hire your weaknesses and you've got to make sure that you're hiring at the pace that you can afford, but not throttling it down so slowly that it chokes the business. So it's a bit of a balancing act there. But step one, recognizing that they have to have help and that those people that are helping are going to expect some kind of compensation. And then you can kind of take it from there.
And just to add to that, this might sound silly, but I have a couple of startups where the founders are brilliant, but they're absent-minded in it to a certain extent. And getting them a good administrative assistant that can keep them organized, sometimes that in and of itself changes the whole dynamic. So it's just looking at what the team needs.
Yeah, definitely. Althea, I'm going to throw it to you too, but I'm also going to throw you a little bit of a curveball because we just had a question coming in about how do you tactfully communicate with a faculty when you see the candidate faculty maybe just isn't the right person to be that full-time person at the startup company. So if you could give some advice on that as well.
Sure. Definitely had to do that dance before. So I think it's one of the things that is really hard to communicate and get across the line in terms of someone who has an idea that is amazing is that the idea plus execution is really where you're going to be successful. And so having them value that execution part more fully is kind of that piece that often is missing, because you can't just hire a random person off the street to do the execution part. You won't succeed. And so it is a dance, and understanding that. And so usually you're kind of doing that, what are your weaknesses type of conversation with the faculty when they're not the right person to fill. So I often kind of lean on that sort of, you're really great at X, Y, and Z, and here's where I'm seeing that we're going to need to backfill, and what that person should look like, and who would you want as your collaborator, your teammate. Nothing goes forward in a vacuum. You really need to understand that this is a team dynamic that we need to really, and really kind of lean hard on that, is that they're not relinquishing any sort of real leadership role, but they're needing to have additional team members with them. And so that's usually how I try to do it. I have the luxury of it in the EIR program, especially, is that, and also in my previous role as an investor, which is if they can't get there, then I don't need to work with them. Because, you know, it's going to be a really hard road for that opportunity. And it's going to be rough for anyone to really truly invest if someone isn't coachable.
Absolutely. So we have about 10 minutes left of our regularly scheduled time. We're going to go over 15 minutes. So we'll go to 15 minutes past the hour, but I know a bunch of people are like going to have to leave at the hour. I do want to try to get to a bunch of the questions that have been sent in, and then we'll probably get back to our regularly scheduled questions that we talked about before. But because we've had a lot of questions right in, I want to get to those. So one question is, there is this relationship that is being built up between a mentor and a mentee, but sometimes it can be fraught initially with tensions and misunderstandings. And before meeting with investigators, what do you wish the investigator mentees were already armed with in terms of business awareness and skills development? Like what programs would have been, would make your job easier in building that initial relationship? And Julie, maybe I'll go with you first on this one.
Yeah, it's so wild. It's all over the map. But the common thread, and we've talked about it, is somebody that's willing to listen and willing to learn. It's you would be surprised at how many times there are certain categories of individuals where you tell them something and they come back and they have absorbed everything you said and they've changed their pitch, they've changed their questions. And then there's a group of people you tell them something, and then every time you see them, they have the same issue again and again and again. So for a mentee to be strong is you have to listen. The other thing I've I don't know, since I've done this so many times, I maybe not as tactful as Althea when I give my feedback. So I've had mentees who, when I give them some hard feedback or something that may be difficult to hear, then they go shop for a new mentor. And they're looking for somebody who's going to agree with their opinion. And then ultimately, and almost every time, they've come back to me and I say, you should have listened to me the first time. So
I think it's that, like, you don't want to surround yourself with yes men.
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Don, anything you want to add or?
Not listening skills are huge, questioning skills too. Like I've seen some really strong results for customer discovery workshops. A lot of I-Core, regional I-Core kind of function, has really helped. So those, if, an I-Core program really does help. The national one can be daunting at times, but if I'm on the fence of, maybe we've gone through a business model canvas and I'm still not sure about the value proposition and maybe questioning about the team, if I can get them even into a regional I-Core, that helps a lot. Because it's other voices kind of collaborating on and pointing at kind of the same thing. That one's a big one for me, I think.
So, and let me expand on that one, because I-Core, they insist that you talk to what is it done, 100 customers?
Yeah, it's 100 in the national, which
Yeah,
that's a lot.
and I would say that so often people come to me and they've talked to one customer, and a lot of times that one customer is not even a representative customer or not a big customer. And so when I encourage them to do the I-Core or encourage them to do customer discovery, talking to 3 customers is painful, but if you talk to 50 customers, you will understand your business in a way that you didn't before you started. So it really is critical. And I'm very pro I-Core for that reason.
Amen.
And I think like a smaller lift initially, at least my wish list would be that they have done a competitive landscape analysis. Like they really know what's been done in the clinic and why it failed, why their approach is different or the same as something else. Those, and it's research, like what are you doing that's different? Because often you'll run across stuff that's been done a couple decades ago and it didn't go anywhere. So trying to answer that why and why yours is better and why you're revisiting it is also kind of one of those questions that I often have. So those types of like understanding where your field really is at is a key one too.
That's, yeah. All that is fantastic advice and helping, and you're exemplifying exactly what it is that you're helping each of them with. So I'm going to move on to a totally different subject, and it's because we got a lot of questions on this beforehand, and we've also gotten some now as well. And it's about compensation for these particular programs. So, just to confirm, you are all compensated for your roles at the institutions. Yes. So, just to let everyone know, they're all nodding their heads.
Yep.
One of the questions that we had come in is whether there is any equity component of what you receive. So. And I
So,
don't believe so. Don, yeah, why don't you go first?
so our rule here is that if equity does get offered, you can go through a process to do, COI, and you can actually take some potentially, but it's not something that we really encourage, or, I personally don't want to be in that situation. It changes the dynamic. As an MIR, I can basically be still a little bit separated and give very strong advice with absolutely no attachment to the success or failure of the company. I want them all to win. I want every one of the startups we work with to thrive, but I think it does change the dynamic if you become an equity holder. If that does happen, though, our process is you do the COI, and then you step away as their mentor, and assign somebody else. And then you can just be a business consultant on the side. So it's not a huge hardship, but it does change the dynamic. I think personally. So.
All right. Anything else you guys want to add about compensation?
For UCSF, we're really set up. It's a part-time role, and we're set up to take out companies. Is the hope, and so from that you would switch off of a XIR role and you would take equity instead. So kind of keeps it a little bit cleaner. But I do think it's a hard line. You have to really juggle that.
All right. Thank you all for answering those particular questions. I know a number of people are going to have to leave soon. We do have a survey in the chat. I will also pull up as you leave, so please do answer that survey. Part of the reason that we are doing this particular program is people kept asking us more about EIR programs. And so again, very thankful to have everyone here talking about their roles as EIR, XIR, MIRs. I'm going to ask a next question now, which again from the audience, about legal and operational support to faculty founders. Do your programs provide anything in those particular areas? And Julie, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, we get approached, as I spend, every week, someone will ask me, how do I divide startup equity? Every week I will get a call from a law firm or a venture capital asking for introductions. So we do have law firms that have offered very attractive packages to help startups get off the ground. And so we do have that level of support. Operational support, we do also have we keep a curated list of, part-time fractional CFOs, which are very useful, fractional other HR type of resources. Super, super useful. So that's what comes to mind.
Anyone else want to answer that?
I mean, I'm very cautious. Like our licensing group does all of the we work with outside folks to do the patent prosecution and all of that. We have ecosystem partners that will handle some of the heavy lifting on operating agreements and the legal side of it. Whenever I'm talking about this to a PI, I'm very, very specific about the fact that I am not an attorney and that you must run all of this by an attorney. But I will say, hey, you've got a partner. Do you have an operating agreement? Okay, well, that's step one. So here's a template. Take this, start to populate it, then hire an attorney. And here's a list of 15 that we've worked with in our ecosystem that have all done a good job. Have fun, right? Because we can't be biased and pick and say, well, only use this one. We kind of do the same thing that a general contract, you go to Home Depot and you want to do an install and they give you a list of contractors. That's kind of that way, except it's all based on how well they've done in the past. So we have a lot of service providers, and Sparkle will pay some money for some of those upfront legal costs to some of our early stagers. So, but you really want to make sure that you tell people that they should talk to counsel, really. I'm not an attorney, and don't play one on TV. So I have experience, but that doesn't hold up in court.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard position, having dealt with multiple universities and doing startups out of them, because you're forming an independent entity, for-profit entity. And so the university has to keep it at arm's length to some degree. But it is really hard when you're trying to spin something out and you don't have the support, you don't have the, 5K that you need for legal support at that moment in time. And so I think there is a gap, and there's different ways to try to, kind of put things together, but I think there is still that tension, if you will. And maybe that's good, because that weeds out some of the, entrepreneurs who aren't ready to just fully commit and try to figure out how to piece together something. But it is a bit of an agita, I won't lie. As an XIR at UCSF, it's hard, because you're like, we could start this, but we don't have the resources yet.
Our next question from our audience is, how are the pre-venture projects selected for you to work on? Are there eligibility considerations for them to be able to get to work with you? Or just how does that particular process work? And Althea, I'll start with you.
It's kind of an organic matchmaking experience, if you will. So, I'm sure some of the teams that I've met with are probably like, maybe not. And then there's other teams where I've like really clicked. So there's not really any prescribed, like, some of it's been, these opportunities have fallen into the EOD team bucket because they are identified as potential startup opportunities. So I don't see anything that is just going for licensing, for instance. But other than that, it's kind of a free-for-all.
Thanks, Julie.
I think we try to handle every single request that comes into our office. We try to be a super responsive organization. And so then what you try to do is set up tasks, and people will go away, and sometimes they don't come back. You say, put together a deck and we'll come back and we'll present it. And so a lot of it is sort of weeding out who's really serious and who's not. And you'd be surprised that at any given time, the place where you spend your time is the place where you should be spending your time. And other people are kind of slowly getting to a realization of where they should be. So yeah, I think we pride ourselves in trying to handle every single request and at least send them off in the right direction.
Yeah, we're kind of the side, I say this all the time. We don't pick winners and losers. When I have the fund management hat on, we do. But when it's general engagement with our researchers, anybody that fills out an invention disclosure can get support from us. But there's some self-selection that happens down the path. In my current capacity, I can tell you how I route things. So we'll get to a point where a PI decides they want to do a startup. The licensing rep will reach out to me and say, hey, they're in this space and this is what they're doing. And then I'll look at the bench. I have an incredible group of mentors that work on the team. My first step is to try to match skill set and industry experience if possible. And in the physical science world, it's not as critical. In life sciences, you really have to there's some specialty knowledge that is pretty important. Like if you have a med device person trying to do a therapeutics startup, that's difficult, right? And there's just some stuff that just isn't there. But for me, if there's industry experience, that's a bonus. But then I'm just looking at bandwidth and trying to do a little bit of personality matching. I will meet the PI first, always, and have kind of the general discussion, and then I go back and try to figure it out. And then if there's nobody on the bench, then sometimes I'll take them. But if they want to try it, we're going to lean in. And if we have a failed business, but a better entrepreneur for the next time with this PI that we engaged with, that's still a win. So we really lean in on everything.
So Don, I'm going to ask the next question of you first. Are there any particular challenges you've faced in your work as an MIR in your particular example? Any war stories you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. One of my favorite stories it's actually a case where I was wrong. It's fantastic. So I have a civil engineering professor that is working in construction, and he has a particular part of he cuts steel fibers that go into ultra high performance concrete. I'll just say it. So um, I was like, okay, well, we should probably license this. And he's like, no, I want to create a factory and start cutting fibers, right? And I took 4 months trying to talk him out of that because I lived in factories in my youth, and I'm like, you don't want to touch it, just But I got to a point where I realized he was not going to back down. So I said, okay, I'm going to help you make the best factory possible. And that was 5 years ago, and they're still going. And every year they're selling more fibers. So, you know, you have to be willing to meet them where they're at, push them a little bit. And if they're insistent on it, how the heck do I know, right? I always say I thought the iPad was stupid when they first released it, and now I can't live without it. So to know that there's going to be times where you're just missing a piece or you're wrong, you've got to be willing to meet them where they're at sometimes, right? So other than that, I've had a pretty good run as far as, not having any major issues that are outside of kind of your normal things that you would deal with that we've already kind of covered. So I've been lucky so far.
Oh, great. Thanks, Don. Julie, same question to you.
Yeah, in my career, I've raised a lot of money from venture capitalists, but I think I counted at one time. I tried to count the number of times I pitched VCs, and I've raised a lot of money, but I got a lot more no's than I ever got yeses. And so when my companies that I work with at Caltech get a no, it triggers me. It's like I'm brought back to when I was fundraising on my own, and I lose my mind because it's like they're calling my baby ugly. And so I feel like if I put the time and energy and I think this is a good thing and I bring it to an angel investor who trusts me, they should say yes. So yeah, so that's my big pet peeve is, and 9 times out of 10, I'm sorry if this sounds conceited, but I'm right.
I love it. Althea.
I really don't think I've had too many war stories at UCSF. I mean, obviously beforehand, yes. I think my biggest one probably was that I was doing a pitch deck and I spent time actually doing it and revamping it and kind of making it pretty and branding. And then the PI just basically redid it all again. And you just feel like, but I mean, that's part of the experience, right? You're learning
Yep.
if you can work with these individuals or not. And so, but it was definitely a little bit disheartening, I'm not gonna lie.
Well, so I have a couple more questions for you guys, and then we're gonna have a couple of follow-up questions. I'm gonna follow up with you from the audience that are more individual to you. So we're gonna do those afterwards. We'll do an email about that. But I want to talk about impacts. I'd love to hear about impacts that you've seen from your work with the academicians, and are there expectations on what the impact is supposed to be for your position for the programs? And Julie, I'm gonna start here with you.
So by impact, you mean I've changed the outcome?
Yeah, right. Or something maybe got off the ground and that maybe wouldn't have. Or are there expectations about from the institution, like, oh, we want you to see this many startups get launched this year or something like that?
So we talked about the pace of the university and the impedance mismatch of an entrepreneur, and I am 100% through and through an entrepreneur. So sometimes startups need to bend the rules here and there to make things happen. So I've had a startup that was being offered a significant amount of free compute for their company, and we were trying to figure out how to break through the university and get them the ability to be able to use this, even though their company hadn't been formed yet. So I'm just really good at not seeing barriers. I just like plow through them. So I've done that for a few companies. Second one that I had a big impact on was I have this company that I love. It's a robotics company, but they were struggling on the fundraising. And so I actually came and sat in on a few fundraising meetings. I just sat in the back and watched what happened. And it was so obvious what was going wrong and how the person was answering questions and how they were not reading the audience. And it was so easy to fix that. and help them rejigger their strategy so that it was actually more coherent. So those are two that come to mind.
Althea, same question about impacts. And actually, we had one question from the audience was particularly about life sciences. Have any of the startups you've been working with been successful? And successful, of course, is such a loaded word, but have they gone on to raise funding, I guess.
I will hopefully have an answer for you in a couple months' time. So cross your fingers. It is not an easy time in early stage biotech. It is rough. So I can't necessarily say like that there's any demonstrable like impact metrics at the moment for myself and as an XIR. I do think that I'm also, life sciences, it's just a longer timeline. But I do really I've been so impressed with the other XIRs, and their feedback, their connectivity, how the opportunities are triaged. So I think that does have a lot of impact around sort of direction where the PI should be taking their programs, and then identifying which ones to really spend more time on to build out. So I'm hopeful. So stay tuned.
I'm very hopeful as well. Don.
Well, impact's relative, and at the individual scale, the impact is when you see that light come on. When you're working with a professor at any of these universities, right? They're high up, they're leaders in their field, but they don't know maybe how to launch a startup. And when you see that first light come on, or you have that first meeting when it becomes business discussions versus product market fit, like that's impact. But then you start expanding and looking out, and you see all the economic impact that spinning these startups have, and how it lifts regions and it helps, fuel economies. And then you take it another step and you look at something like Histosonics. We had a company in our portfolio that's a 25-year overnight success, and they're essentially obliterating tumors with sound waves, right? And that thing took forever to get here. They tried everything. They pivoted so many times they were almost going in a circle, but they finally figured it out. And now that's probably going to be a massive exit, but it's also potentially on a path to curing cancer. So, I can take those impacts and talk about them from one business meeting with a PI that finally figures out business all the way to melting tumors. So I'm a Kool-Aid drinker on this whole industry and the value of academic research and the impact of commercializing it. So yeah, it's massive.
Definitely. And we are all very hopeful, obviously, that the downstream of what it is that you are working on right now will make an impact, obviously not just for your institutions, but for everyone, because these innovations are broadly going to help the world. So really happy to have had you here today. I have one last question for you. We're actually going to try to pull it up the slide, and we'll actually probably when we send out the recording for this, we'll send out actually your email addresses as well, so that because there are some people who haven't had their questions answered, and I want to make sure that we do get answers to those as well. So we will provide your email addresses in that particular format. But my last question for you is actually one that came from the audience during this session, and it is, do you have recommendations for universities looking to hire serial entrepreneurs like you? And how do they attract the talent like you to join these particular programs? And thank you very much, Katie, for so if people have other questions, they can contact everyone here. But I'm going to start off this one with you, Don, about the recommendations to hire folks like yourselves.
Well, okay. So this is tricky because you have to go a little deeper than the resume. You have to go a little deeper than the LinkedIn profile. I think the most important thing, I have almost like a rolling list of entrepreneur types that are in the right time in their life to potentially be an MIR, EIR, or maybe they're ready to take one more bite at the apple and really go take another startup out. So I think it's important to just be active in the ecosystem and take phone calls, if someone reaches out to me and says they want to know about what we're doing or how to get involved, I am always going to talk to them. And for a couple of reasons. One is that, I am spreading the gospel of tech transfer to some extent because myself included, I didn't know this was even an industry until 2017. And now I've figured out that it's one of the most important we have. But I'm also trying to stay in touch and get to know people. You are looking for a unicorn in a sense because nobody's doing MIR work or EIR work for the money. You're doing it for the love of it. You're doing to give back. If you're going on and potentially going out and starting, becoming an EIR to stay at a company, that's a different kind of animal. But it's really about just making sure, don't just blindly agree. If somebody wants to get engaged, talk to the people that they're connected with, ask around in the ecosystem, because it's very easy to get fooled when you're bringing someone like this on, because there's a mindset that's required too that isn't traditional in business, I think. So ask a lot of questions, pay attention, talk to a lot of people, and just constantly be in the ecosystem.
Great advice, Don. Althea next.
Well, I think my perspective is probably very different in terms of, I'm not running in any of the programs, but from my perspective, I think the people who really do well in these roles are ones that are okay with early stage technology. And I think that that's a piece that is hard to really, especially life sciences, because you're in sort of industry. You've seen more on the like structured side, and so when you move into early stage innovation, it's very messy and incomplete. And so individuals who are really able to adapt and kind of understand that their team's not going to even necessarily have real in vivo data and how to help them. So I think having those people who are willing to really kind of step up and do that extra bit, and recognize that this isn't necessarily something that's going to make you a ton of money right now, and that you're more in it to be part of the ecosystem and the innovation piece of it all.
Totally agree with that, Althea. Julie, final words to you.
So first of all, everybody wants this job. I get calls all the time. People go, "That is the coolest job. How do I get a job like that?" So I think universities should know that this is a sought after job because you're at a very interesting point in entrepreneurial creation. I've also seen a number of different EIRs over the course of my time doing this, and each of them brings a different thing to the table. So I've started 4 companies myself and run them. So I have a lot of practical advice that's, from hard-won activities. Another one of our EIRs had worked at McKinsey in drug discovery and had his incredible process for how do you choose a target candidate for drug. So that's another skill set. Third person was unbelievable at putting process in place. So for a little company that's trying to build something out of nothing, somebody that's great at process. So once again, it's the skill sets that the person bring a different thing to the job, and they're all useful.
Yeah. Well, this has been incredible. Thank you all so much for your time, Julie, Althea, Don, today. I think that it was incredibly educational. We have so many more questions we could answer, but hopefully with the contact information, if people want their specific questions answered, they can reach out to you. Really appreciate your time today. Those of you who've stuck with us this entire time, I know we went a bit longer as usual on the webinar than we had expected, but thank you for being here, for asking all these wonderful questions. Thank you for joining us. We always really appreciate everyone attending these webinars, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.